Welcome everyone to week 2 event of our CSOC seminars. As you know, we are focusing on diaspora of the Southeast Europe this hilary term. And the conveners are Manolis Pratsniakis and Otonomas Sasakis. And Fotini Kalens. Today we have a seminar titled Transnational Citizenship, Views of Serbia's Active Diaspora. Hopefully it will shed light on the diasporic movements of the Serbians living abroad, especially their voting behavior. And it will focus on, it will talk about 2 surveys that had been conducted in and around 2017 Serbian elections. It will also talk about, shed light, if I may, on the diasporic behavior of Western Balkan voters. We have a distinguished speaker with us today, Tena Prelec. She is a doctoral fellow at University of Sussex. Also, she's doing, let me see, a lot of things. She's a research associate at LSEE, Research on Southeastern Europe, European Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science. Her foremost field of expertise concerns the politics and political economy of Southeast European countries, with a focus on the transition economy, corruption and the rule of law, EU enlargement and migration. So without further ado, Tina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ezgi. Thank you, Autumn. Thank you, Manolis. Thank you, Fotini. Thank you for having me here. I'm thrilled to be talking about such an important topic with you, and I'm thrilled that you have such an important project going on at CSOC, focusing on the diaspora. As we talked just now, this is a topic that definitely, whose importance is not going to wane in Western Balkan countries and further. And I think it's going to become more and more important as we go on. So about my presentation today, I will talk to you about the way this research on the Serbian diaspora that I will present to you is framed is within the concept of transnational citizenship. So citizenship has been traditional in the literature linked very closely with territory. And therefore also the diaspora, or diasporas, were closely linked with a country and a territory. However, with increased migration movements and with increased globalization in general, there is quite a big push in the literature to decouple the two. So to consider diasporas like transnational communities. And therefore, here I highlighted a quote by an eminent scholar of migration who argues that if citizenship rights will have to extend beyond nationality and state, that they will have to extend beyond nationality and state territory if liberal democracies are to remain true to their own principle of inclusive membership and equal basic rights. So this is a principle that is actually contested. But I would argue that it is a framework to keep in mind in the context of studying different migration patterns and also the value and the actions of diasporas nowadays. The fact that the world is ever more connected and that migration is becoming the norm rather than the exception. The research I'm presenting, as Ezgi mentioned, results from 2 surveys that I've conducted around the Serbian presidential elections in 2017. And it is interesting, the findings that I will present, because they focus on a specific aspect that is usually not so highlighted when we discuss about the diasporas from the Western Balkans. Usually the value that is highlighted in terms of people who migrate from the Western Balkans and how they can contribute to their own country. What is highlighted the most is the economic value, so the remittances and how they can maybe even come back and with their skills help their countries, but it's mostly on this economic, very pragmatic dimension. On the other hand, the issues that come out from the reviews, as I'll explain shortly, actually highlight also the democratic potential of the diaspora, meaning that there is a potential of those people to further their countries not only from an economic perspective, but also in terms of perhaps the political perspective. The way I framed it, so my object of research is not the diaspora in general, but it is specifically the active diaspora, as I called it, meaning that those are the people who took an interest in the electoral process. Those are the ones who applied to my survey. So those are specifically the ones that I'm focusing on. Now, just a bit of background about the Serbian diaspora or diasporas as a whole. So we have several migration waves, starting from the 1912, 1920, when there was a lot of economic migration to the US, Australia, Canada, and South America. Then a big wave during and just after the Second World War, where there was a big outflow of former communists. Then during the 1960s, 1970s, with economic issues in Yugoslavia, there were those Gastarbeiter programs that allowed a lot of people, economic migrants, to go out of Yugoslavia and into places like Germany, Western Europe, and in some cases also America. And then in the 1990s, we have, of course, the wars, conflicts, and displacement. So my point with just showing you this brief history is that mostly up to the 1990s, we have people who were unhappy in a way or the other with the communist regime that was in place. So perhaps also for this reason, this notion of the Yugoslav diasporas in general, and Serbian in particular, for the purpose of this study, was that they are very nationalistic. They're very radical in terms of being on the right side of the political spectrum. And especially those who were vocal about representing their country. And in the 1990s, we see that with the diaspora groups in the States and also in Europe, in some cases supporting Milosevic and Tudjman from the other side, from Croatian side. About today, we do not know so much. And yet, even though we do not know exactly, there are not so many good studies on this purpose, there is still this perception that the diasporas are nationalistic. And this is something that in the literature goes beyond the Western Balkans. It's something that it's called long-distance nationalism. So there is this assumption, grounded in some facts, but more and more put under question mark, that groups of people who migrate from their countries and stay for and go to another country, that they actually radicalize their opinions, that they crystallize in that moment, and that as time goes on, they actually become even more nationalistic than beforehand. As I said, there are some studies that are now putting this in doubt, and also the results of recent elections, as we'll see, put a big question mark on this. And yet we do not know exactly what these people are thinking. Now, in terms of the Serbian diaspora, it's a very significant number of Serbs who are living abroad. And this is in line with the amount of other Western Balkan diasporas living abroad. It is a big contingent and growing by the day. So according to the International Organization for Migration, in 2015, there were about 1 million Serbs living abroad. So that's almost 10% of all Serbian citizens. But this number is supposed to be much larger. Even the Serbian government estimate says it's 3.5 million. So the issues to explore in this context are: what are the views of this active diaspora today, And is their participation in the political process in any way hindered or not? So I'll proceed first. I'll give you some insights from this research, and then I'll add some comparative perspective to get us started for the discussion later. These are the main takeaways from the research. So it is a quite stark call for renewal that was presented from the respondents' opinions. So there is a stark opposition to the government in power in this moment, and a rejection of the course the country has taken. Second, and I'll come to explaining all those instances better in the next slides. But second, what seems to be profiling is a cross-cutting cleavage between the state and also between the home country and the countries abroad, of people who are pro and anti the status quo. And then third, and quite importantly, that the concerns of the active diaspora are not so linked with geopolitical motives, meaning those relating to issues like Russia, Kosovo, that are usually seen in line with a nationalistic stance, but rather they concern governance, they concern the course their country has taken. And finally, the respondents highlighted a list of barriers to the vote. So the research was done around the presidential elections in April 2017. And let me introduce you some of the main candidates. You will probably all be familiar with the top left person, so that's Aleksandar Vučić. He's currently president in Serbia after those elections, and at that point he was the prime minister of the country. So those elections basically served to consolidate his power even further on the Serbian government and on the Serbian state in general. So from the position of a very, very powerful prime minister, he became the president with those elections. The second, so middle up, is the main opposition candidate for those elections, who was called Saša Janković, and he used to be the ombudsman up until that moment. And then the other candidates, we have the third one, who was actually a spoof candidate. So he was running as a joke, like literally. He called himself in a different way, Ljubiša Preletačević, which means, which is a joke that refers to politicians going from one party to the other. And it tells a lot about the disenchantment with Serbian politics of the voters, the fact that he managed to get almost 10% of the vote and end up in third place. And then in the third row we have Jeremić, who was one of the opposition candidates, let's say from the center right. Then we have Šešelj, a far right former Hague Tribunal accused of war crimes, and he's the head of the Radical Party, from which party Aleksandar Vučić originated at the beginning. And finally, another opposition candidate, Saša Radulović, who was also, let's say, from a centrist type of position. So, as you see, the interesting thing in this, here are the same numbers, but maybe put in a way that is clearer to understand. The most striking outcome is that whereas in the country, whereas in Serbia, you had over 50%, 55% of people voting for Aleksandar Vučić, so for the status quo, for the person in power. In the diaspora, you had a very significantly lesser portion of people voting for him, 29%. On the other hand, Saša Janković, the main opposition candidate, the situation is exactly reversed. So we have 16% of people in Serbia overall who voted for him, whereas in the diaspora is 42%. So when you count up all the votes, the total vote for non-nationalist option, or rather, I would call it better, an anti-status quo option. Whereas in Serbia it was around 33% if you count all the opposition candidates. Abroad it was actually 62.3%. So where does this leave us here with the, with the notion of the Serbian diaspora being nationalistic? Clearly, there's something very different going on. So this is the amount of this is the survey that we run. So we had 322 respondents, which might seem as not such a huge number when you compare it to usual surveys and elections. However, if you put this in perspective with the number of people who registered and who actually voted, it is quite significant, because even though the diaspora, as we said, is very large, estimates go from 900,000 people to 3 million, the number of people who voted at these elections was only 9,500. And also the number of countries with voting stations was 32. We had a lot of different countries who responded to the survey, and also to try to correct for the foreseen bias of maybe this survey coming from let's say groups that were linked more with a progressive stance rather than with a traditional right-wing status quo stance. I try to make an effort to contact proactively groups of SNS voters abroad, meaning SNS is the the party of the progressives of Aleksandar Vučić, and also church groups, etc., etc. And the way the survey was distributed was not with an open link on the internet, but it was rather by contacting specific groups and by saying to people, there is this research going on, please contact us if you would like us to send you the link. So that's the way we tried to, I tried to control for the foreseen bias. And the responses we were getting were extraordinary. So I thought that it was probably still biased. And yet, at the end of the day, I mean, extraordinary meaning that the voting predictions that they were given were very much pro the opposition rather than pro Vučić. And I thought that it might not be that all those precautions were not enough. And yet, when the results came out, they were like this. So actually, it was completely in line with what the results were. So that was a proof that actually we managed to gather a quite relevant sample. So this is the more or less the level of education that the respondents had, and as you can see, it's extremely high. So a lot of them have master's degrees, and even almost 14% had even a PhD. So the people who replied to this survey and who were interested in this process, on the whole, seemed to be of that quite educated sector of the population. And this is the most striking finding, that when asked in a quite neutral way, what is your opinion of Serbia's government at present, the positives were only 1.2%. The neutrals were 6%, the negatives were 21%, and 71% of people said very negative. And that was supplemented by the qualitative information that they've given us in the survey. So really, there was you could sense that also that was probably the reason why so many people replied so enthusiastically to this survey and decided to spread it along their acquaintances, etc. It's because they really felt very strongly that the reason why they left had to do with something that they perceived as an injustice at home. So these are some of the voices. They say we need to build a new society, a new system, a new society. There is no strength nor time for the further implementation of something which is deviant in substance. They also said, a lot of them, not all of them, some of them said they want to stay where they are abroad, but many of them expressed the desire to somehow be reintegrated and have a role back home. And they said there are many of us who would like to come back and invest in Serbia, but to do so we need strong institution and a state that works. We left because we feel like second-rate citizens in our own country. So this second finding that I mentioned at the beginning, this cross-cutting cleavage, this is something that I think needs to be researched further, but there are some indications from these surveys that this might be the case. So just to give you an idea, before these elections, if you were somehow, if you were part of if you were a Serbian citizen and you had a social media account, or you were interested in, in Serbian politics as I am, there were very high chances that you were in one of two echo chambers. So it was impossible from my side of the fence, let's say, and from the side of the fence of everyone I knew. Almost everyone was under the strong impression that it was impossible that there would not be a second round. So that Vučić would go through the first round, the 50% threshold at the beginning. Almost everybody thought it was impossible because they didn't know anybody who said that would vote for him. Okay. On the other hand, there must be another echo chamber that is not mine, that with a quite different response, because of course when the results came out, it was 55% in favor of the ruling, so of the prime minister who then became president, and that also sparked very big demonstrations on the streets of Belgrade and other cities in Serbia. So for almost a full month, people went out to the streets every day, for no other reason than to protest against the dictatorship, they called it. So just like basically a call. I think it was more of a collective therapy to go out every day and just to say what kind of country we're living in. So there is this echo chamber, and then there must be another one. So the reason I'm saying that there might be this cross-cutting cleavage. So rather than having in one country, like right and left or a division there, it seems more to be like urban-rural divide that is now a transnational divide rather than being just within the country, because within the questions that I asked was also how will your friends and your family vote, and I expected that they would say, well, some of my friends, some of my family members will vote for the status quo, for Vučić or for Šešelj or for other options, but actually they noted like they would even more of them would vote for the opposition, because that in Serbia they didn't have those barriers for the vote that they did. So that's why that's likely. And one possible discriminant for this choice is the way that information about politics reaches those people, because our respondents, they said that so almost 90%, over 90% of them gets information from the online world rather than from the TV or the Serbian print media, which has made a lot of tabloids that are regime friendly, and the TVs, both the public TV and some of the private TVs are very much an extension of the government, if I may say so. This, I think, for me is the most fascinating finding, because they had some choices to express. So what do you think, what is the biggest problem? What are the key issues in Serbia today? And as you can see, so, we usually, if we associate the diaspora with those nationalistic stances, with, diaspora funding, Kosovo, etc., so giving funds for those kind of efforts, actually the outcomes that we had from this active diaspora are exactly the opposite. They are not so interested in what happens with Russia, with Kosovo, and even with the EU. The EU perspective is not a big problem for them. I mean, they don't think this is a key issue in Serbia, maybe because it's going towards the EU. But what is very clear is that what they think that are the most important issues are the way the country works. So corruption, judiciary, media freedom, the lack of democracy, countering crime and corruption, the education system, and the fact that inequality is widespread. So here we are, once again. So the underlying desire that they expressed, in a way, is that they want to see fairness. They want to see a level playing field for everyone. And that's for them the key issue, and why they think there's a problem with their home country, and why they are not able to go back there for a reason. So here, just, as a side note, we hear a lot about those foreign actors in the Balkans. We hear it, in policy circles. It's in every consultation that the US government does, UK government does. And it's actually, I think, good, because it's bringing back a spotlight onto the Western Balkans, whereas for some time they were not so much paid, there was not so much attention paid to them. And yet, these issues are actually, in a large part, I'm not saying 100%, but for a big part, they are promoted by the same governments. So the biggest factor of Russian influence, the biggest promoter of Russian influence in the Serbian state is the Serbian government itself, through its tabloids that are constantly playing up, Putin, and playing up this link. So rather than a fundamental issue, I would say, for people, it's something that has been played up, and that now has become even I think a real issue, because more and more the right wing the people who associate with some sort of nationalistic and right wing positions in Serbia see in Russia their savior, and they think they're giving them a lot of funding and of money, even though in fact it's the opposite. It's the EU that it's funding much more and helping much more Serbia and the Western Balkans than Russia is. So now we're coming to the last issues, which is barriers to the vote. So here is a map of the polling stations that were opened. And as you can see on a global level, for instance, it's quite clear that there are no polling stations in Australia, a place where a lot of Western Balkan diaspora live. And in general, you can see even in Europe, just one in France, one in the United Kingdom, nothing in Spain, in Portugal, etc., etc. So the reason for that is that there was a very, very, very short time for them for people in diaspora to apply for the registration. There was only 1 week. And the second, the communication process was really bad. So the consulates and the embassies didn't. This is what comes from the respondents. They said that even they didn't use the usual channels to inform everybody. And if there are not at least 100 people registered, then the polling station is not open. So that created. So there are those issues, as I said, short notice, the lack of effective communication, which brought to the scarcity of voting stations. And even they said there were a lot of IT issues in embassies and consulates that made it difficult. And finally, there was the need to vote in the same place in both rounds. So this was, as very often, it was an election done in a very with a short time frame. And it was announced for the first round to be 2 weeks before Easter, and round 2 was scheduled on Easter Sunday itself. So a lot of people would have traveled, but they had to vote in the same place in both rounds in case of a second round. So again, here are some of the voices about the option of only voting in the same place in 2 rounds. They say, I felt infuriated and totally powerless. And they tried to have a conversation with the embassy, but they told them, this is what the government ministry said, and no, we cannot show you any notification. And so there's this lack of transparency that they were decrying as something that made them feel very powerless. And second, the fact that for sure, if you're living somewhere in the south of France and you need to go to Paris just to vote, this is extremely expensive, so they couldn't do it. And also again that the notification was lacking. So there are all those issues that made it very expensive, very difficult for people to go and vote. And finally, these are the conditions for the return that they set. So as I said, many of them said that they would like to return, but these are usually the conditions that they set as the lowest bar. And first of all, it's achieving the financial freedom, because they say, yes, I would like to go back home. I am homesick in many ways, but I want to earn enough money so that when I go back home, I can be free of political influences and I can be basically achieve freedom from the way things are done in Serbia today. Second, this fair competition, the end of particracy or partocracy, as they call it. So a meritocracy, a level playing field. And third was the concern for the children about the type of society they're going to live in. So one person mentioned, as long as corruption and a disregard for rules are present in all spheres of life, I'm not thinking about the return to Serbia. So now, if I have enough time, I would like to make a bit of a comparative approach. Yeah. So I want to give you some insights from how it compares across the region, to then make some final conclusions and to ask you to contribute to the discussion with your own insights for your own countries. So this is a short overview of what the situation with out-of-country voting is in the neighbouring countries, in the Western Balkan 6, so-called. So aside from Serbia, it's Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Albania. As you can see from here, actually, this issue, if we then try to think about what can be done, it's not. It's a very varied type of overview, because the physical voting abroad is in this moment present only for Macedonia, and in this case we have very much similar issues than we have for Serbia, so registration barriers, and in fact it's expensive. But in other countries we have the postal vote. And for Montenegro and Albania, there is no possibility of voting abroad yet. So for Montenegro, there's a specific issue, that the fact that they have this problem with Serbs and Montenegrins, so that if they extended the possibility of double citizenship, then a lot of people would be able to vote in the elections from Serbia, mainly because a lot of Montenegrins went out to Serbia. So double citizenship is not allowed, and they are stricter with the type of voting procedure, because that would impact on the electoral outcome, basically. But what I wanted to point out is that some other issues also come out in the postal vote, which was something that was suggested by some of the respondents as a way of overcoming the problems. There is postal vote in Bosnia now, and for instance, for the elections at the end of last year, we had a lot of problems with fraud, and specifically the Bosnian HDZ, so the Croatian Democratic Union from Bosnia, was found as having, with the help of the Croatian HDZ of the same party, they helped them to make a lot of fake registration and multiple registration from the same address. So there is this type of problem in the postal vote, which cannot be overseen. And also, for instance, for Kosovo, even though several of the problems are similar, so the short deadline for the registration and the voting procedural challenges, etc., is also the lack of knowledge and the poor targeting of citizens. So there is also a problem of involving and of educating really citizens abroad to their rights as voters and as citizens, etc. So, but aside from the Western Balkan 6, I think Croatia is definitely a very good, very interesting other case. So when I published preliminary results of this research initially, I was asked, so wow, interesting, but why do you think that Croatia has such a nationalistic diaspora, whereas Serbia, you're saying, is not? Because Croatia is seen still as having their voters from the diaspora being always very, very loyal to the HDZ, so that's the Croatian Democratic Union, the right-wing party which is now in power. Well, my answer is actually that it is not different. It is the same, and I'll explain why. The reason why still today the diaspora from Croatia votes in this way is that it's down to the biggest number of what is considered, from a legal perspective, diaspora from Croatia, are located in Herzegovina still, so in Bosnia. And those people are very loyal HDZ voters. So there is a difference from the ethnic Croatians abroad and the latest wave of migrants, just like the Serbs. And I'll tell you why I argue that. So of course I do not have any results because I haven't done research on that yet, but there are many indications of that. So for instance, there are several surveys stating that the economic motives are not the number one motive for Croatians to go outside of their country. It is of course a prominent motive, but even more than that is because they want to live in a country with more fitting worldview and moral values, as they say, and more colorful type of things. So when the HDZ from Ireland tried to organize a Christmas rendezvous on their Facebook page, so this ruling party from Croatia had tried to organize a gathering for Croats in Ireland, and maybe I should explain why Ireland is such a specific place. It's because when Croatia entered the European Union in 2013, as you can see from this slide, we have in very few years the number of Croats going abroad has tripled. And in this moment, so Ireland was the first English-speaking country to open their doors to Croatian citizens, to Croatian workers immediately. And that meant that a lot of especially young people went to Ireland. Germany is still the destination number one for Croats, but also Ireland is the place for young Croatians today. So both those places, both Germany and Ireland are places where a lot of this new wave of migrants has gone. So when the ruling party from Croatia told them, oh, let's all meet up in Dublin, let's have a rendezvous, they said, go away from this country. We're here because of your stealing. We're here because of you. And the backlash on their Facebook page was so strong, of people replying, "How dare you, call us to all gather here, whereas we actually flew away. We left our country because of you." That at the end of the day, they had to cancel this planned gathering. Another interesting case is the one of Hungary. And you see here, these are the 2018 parliamentary elections. And as you'll know, so Fidesz is the ruling party in Hungary, the party where Viktor Orban comes from. And as you can see here, Fidesz, whereas it was decisively the first party in the overall results, 50%. In London, in the London vote, we find them at the 5th spot, 7%. The first party is Jobbik, which is far right, okay, yeah. And then we have those LMP, Momentum, etc., etc. So why Fidesz so down and why Jobbik up? So the explanation, and that I need to thank a colleague from UI who took me through this in the analysis, is that the people who left from Hungary to London are usually young and they have a short political memory, so they don't really remember what Jobbik, all the very, very racist and far-right stances that Jobbik had initially. Now it's still far-right, but maybe not so decisively. But their vote was basically not so much pro-Jobbik, but anti-Fidesz. And the reason why they left was because they strongly dislike Fidesz. So that's the way we interpret that. Whereas then you see at the second spot and third spot parties that are very high up in the London vote, whereas in the overall results they're very small. You can see them at 7% and 3% respectively. And those are what we would call progressive pro-democracy parties. Now, why am I showing you a slide with the London vote and not with the overall diaspora? For a similar reason that I mentioned for Croatia, because basically the way that this new wave of migrants votes, which we can identify with the London vote, is different from the way the ethnic Hungarians in countries like, you know, Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, they have all a big contingent of ethnic Hungarians. It's different from the way they vote. So once again, we have this divide of a different type of diaspora, of two different diasporas. And interestingly enough, the ethnic Hungarians who have never actually lived in Hungary can vote by mail, whereas from London you cannot vote by mail. You need to travel to London, okay, so you need to travel to London from other parts of the UK, plus stay for a long time in the queue. When asked whether this policy was deliberate, the answer I got was definitely yes. So there is this, once again, this issue of politicians exploiting these type of dynamics for their own purposes. Bulgaria, this is my last case that I'd like to present to you. These are the 2017 parliamentary elections, and these are the overall results. So the first party up there is GERB, the party in power, Boyko Borisov's party, center-right, and the second one is the Socialists. So they are the two status quo parties in Bulgaria. The third one, United Patriots, is the far-right nationalist party. Then you look at the results from the diaspora, and you see that, yeah, GERB is still the first, and yet the vote for the two status quo party is much, much lower, okay? And you had parties that were almost inexistent in the overall results that are much higher up, you know. So these parties that are seen as reformist, progressive, are much higher up in the diaspora rather than in the overall results. Now, this is again quite interesting because since 2016, these nationalist parties, who are also part of the governing coalition, have been repeatedly trying to push through amendments to the electoral code aimed at suppressing the vote abroad. So they were trying to crack down on the number of polling stations again, to introduce these settlement requirements and pre-registration requirements that would restrict the vote. And for instance, Bulgarians in the UK now cannot vote in the European Parliament elections because of an obligation to stay in an EU country at least 60 days before the EP elections, which doesn't really apply for the UK, because if the UK exits the EU in March, as was foreseen, so there were all those ways of restricting, of trying to restrict the vote. What is interesting, and this is one of the positives that I haven't really highlighted so far, but a lot of diaspora groups are trying to fight back, and the Bulgarian diaspora groups have been very organized lately, and some of these amendments were thwarted by pressure from those diaspora groups. And interestingly, in the last 3 election cycles, the Bulgarian diaspora vote in the UK almost tripled. So quite clearly, it's something that that politicians in power have an interest in thwarting. And on this note, I would also like to add that there are some, even though we talked about mostly negative type of restrictions and of scenarios, but really there is this positive element, this democratic potential of people who would like to be re-engaged. And for instance, there is anecdotal evidence, and again, I think this is an avenue for further research, that Macedonians, young Macedonians from who left from their country previously, or those who were thinking about leaving the country, were slightly less inclined to leave it after the changes that have been going on lately in their country. So, because this, in the words of some people I spoke to, because they saw a window of opportunity to make some changes in their country, and this is also something that I found from activists in Ukraine. They said, okay, it's not perfect, but now we see that we have a possibility of shaping the course of our country. So that means that when some fundamental changes, when there is the possibility, at least when they see when diaspora members or where people in their country see the possibility to change it, and then they are less inclined to leave and actually want to make a positive change in it. So here are the conclusions. So this is specifically as regard to Serbia's, the research on Serbia that I presented to you. So again, the clear finding is that this active diaspora is really strongly opposed to the course the country has taken, meaning the one of top-down rule, and widely critical of the current state of affairs in terms of Serbian politics. Furthermore, that it cares very much so about the governance issues, so about how the country works, disregarding the topics relating to more international relations and to close to nationalistic stances. Then, as I said, that there is this transnational cleavage profiling itself, that they're connected probably to like-minded individuals on the whole. And finally, that there are actually a number of quick wins that we can implement for them to be able to participate in the political process. That there is at this moment, the participation is hindered, and that there is space for growth. And these are some of the possible recommendations. So that the access to the electoral process is widened, possibly that there is representation in parliament, which is not foreseen for Serbia in this moment, that embassies and consulates provide a quicker and more helpful service. Then social interaction, it's something that was already present during the 2017 elections. There were diaspora groups popping up online, and this really helped to inform them and to organize them. But long term, really, what comes out of all this is that only a higher level of inequality and meritocracy in the society is something that is going to engage those people in the right way. But the question is if there is political will to do so. Now, these are only some preliminary suggestions, and I'm really interested in hearing your experiences from your countries in order to be able to understand and to refine what would be the possible policy suggestions one can make. And finally, trying to think more big picture and seeing what all this has to tell us about the way we discuss about the diaspora and how do we research it in the future, and perhaps how do we act upon it in the future from a policy side. I would highlight 4 points. So the first is that as we've seen, this active diaspora, the composition is changing, and of course it's becoming bigger and bigger as more and more people are emigrating from those countries. And really there is this need to problematize this long-distance nationalism type of paradigm, this assumption in the literature that people who are abroad radicalize themselves and stay in their cocoon, that they crystallize themselves. Because even though there are for sure some diaspora groups who are more on the traditional side, but really the indication is that the modern day dynamics are making this assumption weaker and weaker, and that we need to think in a different way and make really a different type of research agenda in this sense. And second, that we cannot think of even the active diaspora as a monolith. So of course there are different diasporas within it, but even this active type of diaspora, so the people who voted the elections, who want to vote, they are not monolithic. And specifically what I singled out is that the ethnic Croats, the ethnic Hungarians, etc., who are settled in a place for a long time, have a different type of approach to their home country than this newer wave of migrants who are really leaving because they do not feel well in their country. So it's a different type of approach. Furthermore, quite clearly there is a lack of solid data. We're still at the beginning of trying to examine this issue inside out. And there is the need for very large scale I think research done on this, so I really applaud your project at Sussex. And that needs to take into account both qualitative and quantitative research in order to be able to comprehend the exact numbers and the composition of the diasporas, because otherwise also this is both an issue of how we make policy recommendations, how we research it, but also it can be misused for political means. So the governments of the Western Balkans have already been playing down the numbers of people going out. So this is something for the future needs to be worked on. Third, that there is quite clearly in some countries a political pushback to restrict the action of the political participation of the diasporas. And finally, what I would like to suggest is that this whole area might be a new task for EU conditionality to take on board. So for the European Union to take this issue really seriously, to be aware of the fact that actually now it's bad. So now for these countries who are still in EU accession phase, meaning the Western Balkan countries. But once, if those countries enter the European Union, like Croatia has done, like Bulgaria and Hungary that we've seen have done, the problem is not going away. It's actually becoming even more accentuated. So what they will have in the long term is countries where the progressively minded citizens and those who are more actually inclined towards making a change that is multicultural and open rather than illiberal are leaving the countries rather than staying there. So it's really in the interest of the European Union to foster this communication between the home countries and their diaspora, because it is not a short-term problem, it is a long-term one. So really I think it needs to be taken much more seriously and possibly included in the EU accession process in terms of EU rule of law promotion. How do we do that? I would like once again to hear your views. I have some views myself on this from a recent report that we've done. But I would like really to open now the discussion and to see from all the countries you're coming from what of this resonates with you and what type of issues are there that this presentation does not comprehend.
Thank you, Tena, for a great presentation.